Hi there, everybody. Hello and welcome to this event as part of our Ideas That Transform series. Today, we're talking about the foster care system and how to better position older youth for better life outcomes. In our work here at the Beeck Center, we explore how cutting edge tools and practices can better serve people who rely on our institutions the most, and with a goal to rebuild trust in those institutions. We're a team of about 30 fellows, students, researchers, and staff who are all working on different ways to use service design, data analysis, software development, user-centered policy, and other tools of our time to focus on a new way of thinking about our public sector and public interest institutions. This fall, we're featuring the work of many of these colleagues through the Beck Center's Idea That Transform series. That's this. In this conversation, we will hear about research done by Think of Us and Bloomworks, exploring how the system works for older youth in foster care who are aging out of care in 5 jurisdictions across the country. And we will discuss their approach, insights, and their vision for positioning older foster youth for better life outcomes. So with that, I wanted to pass the floor to Sixto, founder and CEO of Think of Us and the team that drove this work.
Thank you so much, Emily, for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you all today. And I think so. I'll give you a quick overview of the challenges of transition age youth. The first thing I'll start off with saying is that, there's a special subset of young people when they came into foster care because of either neglect, abuse, or their parents were unable to take care of them, that some of them will come into care and go back home. Some will come into care, live with a family member, get adopted. But there's a group of young people who will end up turning too old and never go back home, not get adopted, not find a forever family, and then end up having to leave the system, right? And the idea that the system had is that you would leave the system with some type of connection, some type of preparation, and unfortunately, that doesn't happen. So Think of Us has been focused on how do we build technology to improve those negative outcomes? Because what we see today is that we see undereducation. So Midwest Studies reports about 3% of young people being able to get a bachelor's degree. We see homelessness, 20% of young people before the age of 26 experiencing homelessness. We see underemployment, about 50% of young people being employed. And I can go on and on and on the negative outcomes. So we thought to ourselves, what is one of the core problems? And we focused in on how young people are interacting with the system and communicating their needs, communicating their goals. And one of the things that we did is we created a proof of concept of a platform, the Think of Us app, where we were able to have young people create goals around their life plan and be able to communicate that with the system. And we went very, very, very wide, right? So we had a bunch of different feature sets. And we got to a place where we are like, okay, now we've tinkered enough, and now we have to go deep. And we wanted to know, like, where are we missing something? What are the core pillars of child welfare that we needed to like build fundamentally on, right? We were inheriting this system that, if we're going to be 100% honest, was just built on this savior complex, built on these very supremacy principles that has literally baked in an intentional racism when it was born, and that racism still lives in this system today. So we wanted to understand some of these pieces. So we decided to do a discovery process to answer some of those questions over the period of from November 2019 to February 2020. And we partner with our colleagues at Bloom in 5 jurisdictions across the United States. And we were in places like New York, Hennepin County, and 3 locations in the Bay Area from Santa Clara to San Francisco. We were able to go ahead and partner with folks. And those findings are impacting all of our work, I Think of Us. But we're also thinking about how does this level up the ecosystem, and what are the findings that we can share with the ecosystem as we get ready to publish our report next month. I'm super excited because you all are actually some of the first folks to actually hear this content in a public setting outside of the team. So now you'll hear from Bloom about the process, and then and then you'll hear from Sarah Sullivan on our team about some of our key findings.
So hi, everyone. My name is Emily Wrightmore, and I am super excited to tell you about some of the process we went through. We were so honored and humbled to work with Think of Us that I think there was a lot of pressure to like do this right. This is a type of project that we tend to take on around discovering and understanding projects that have a very intricate and human element where we think that there might be some process and technology interventions that will lead to the outcomes that we all feel like should be happening. So we were excited to dive in here and support this work because it's just so meaningful. So we designed this we designed this project with the Think of Us team. We flew all down to DC. We spent a few days holed up in a room. This is pre-COVID, so we could do that. And we mapped out what we really wanted to understand and how we wanted to go about doing that. We had the locations mostly set. We understood that we needed to go to these places and talk to a very specific group of people who could give us a better sense for what is actually happening for the programs that they're in. We really wanted to talk to foster youth, but we also knew we needed to talk to their support people. So we spent a lot of time understanding the right way to do that. In particular, we decided that in order to talk to foster youth, we needed to have a different format than we traditionally do for user research. So rather than having two grown-ups talking to one youth and all taking notes, we thought that might be a little bit invasive. This is a very personal topic, and these youth haven't necessarily learned to trust people like us with very good reason. So we went with a workshop format where we would talk to large groups at a time. We would have their familiar support person introduce Sixto, who would talk about his experiences, and we thought we could sort of build trust with them that way. And we moved on to do one-on-one interviews with them afterwards, if only if they volunteered. We also offered cash stipends for all of their participation, so I think that likely helped. So we went to the 5 locations that we announced. We picked those, or that are up here, we picked those because they were a good cross-section of urban versus rural and high functioning versus some with tougher metrics. Yeah, so I think we talked to youth, we talked to their support staff, the people who are paid to support them. We also talked to supportive adults, to people in their lives that weren't necessarily paid to support them. We asked them questions about how they relied on the people in their network, about who they thought their support network was, and what they thought would happen to that support network as they lost the support of the child welfare system. We got really interesting questions, and we definitely learned a lot with each location. So we iterated on how we were asking those questions, because we found that sometimes we were just completely falling flat with the words we were using. So the learning curve was good, but we definitely got a ton of good information that helped us really get a clearer picture into what these youth were experiencing and facing. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Sarah, to talk more about what we heard from the youth.
Thank you so much, Emily. Hi, everybody. Like Emily mentioned, as part of being sort of more culturally appropriate and trauma-informed in our approach in engaging with youth that did not know us, that are often engaged in a variety of research projects. We crafted a series of workshops with participatory research and co-design activities in each one of the locations. And the reason we wanted to do these activities is sort of threefold. One, when you're talking with folks who may be recalling traumatic experiences or triggering experiences, giving them something to do with their hands that is tangible and physical is a somatic trick that helps sort of ground yourself as you're maybe potentially going to something distressing, especially as you'll see as some of the activities will ask them to map out the people in their lives. It also gives youth social permission not to have to sustain uncomfortable eye contact with the research team and the bunch of strangers and adults that are there in the room. And it also provides a different avenue for youth who may be more shy or not as comfortable with expressing themselves verbally to be able to share their thoughts through writing or sketching or drawing. So the three main activities we had were the following. The first one, we asked youth to draw the people in their lives to get a sense of the support network around them. And you'll see in some of these drawings that differ highly. This helped us take stock of the people that they had in their lives, but also understand the youth's mental models around those people, like whom did they feel closest to, whom did they feel like they could trust, whom they could ask for help. We also observed patterns around how youth prioritize or rank the people in their lives, how they considered some paid staff as family, how important their peers and their siblings were, and not just the adults, et cetera, et cetera. Then the second activity that we did was asking youth to list out and share their hopes for themselves, as well as their fears when it comes to aging out of foster care. The majority of these youth were teenagers or getting closer to the age of basically exiting foster care, whether that was before the age of 18 or in extended, what is called ILP programming. So this was helpful to understand a little bit more about, what they anticipated with that big, future deadline looming, what they aspired to achieve, and set them up in a frame where they were thinking about the future. And so the reason we did this is specifically to set up our last activity, which was around asking them to co-design an app that would alleviate their fears that they listed and potentially help make those hopes come true. So again, youth showed us a variety of different features and apps and software and plugins into existing websites. And we coded all the different artifacts. And this is where we started to see some of the trends and themes around the kind of support that they feel like they needed as they were approaching this big transition. Some of the things that surfaced included financial education and literacy, strengthening familial and social connections, having mental and physical health support, or you'll see in some of the ones on the screen, support around housing or support around legal aid and searching for jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Emily to talk about how we went with synthesis.
Thanks. Yeah. So once we were done with a very large amount of interviews and conversations, we regrouped back in DC in a very similar but different tiny room. And Sarah Fatala and I spent a couple days processing all of the feedback that we've gotten from the interviews. We basically all went through and said the things that were most insightful, captured quotes, captured opportunities, et cetera. And we spent a while grouping them and kind of getting them into a place where they made sense, where we thought we could bring in the whole team and start to really pour through. I'll also add that this is really one of the hardest parts of any project, where you feel like you have captured a lot of very important information, and you now need to make sense of it and hang it on a framework that you feel like will carry it forward. So this, I think, was a very intense and exciting few days for us to all spend looking through this work. In the end, I think we were able to pull out some very strong themes to group the things that we'd found into a system that we could then write about. So I want to pass this off to Sarah Sullivan to tell you about the actual work that came out of all of this research.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Emily. So we came out of that intense and exciting process with that video that makes you a little bit dizzy when you watch it too fast. with an answer to the question that Sixto posed, at the start of this, which is, what were we missing? Think of us had spent a long time going wide on this problem, but this was our opportunity to go deep and really step back and say, what were we missing, and what is child welfare missing when it comes to the young people who have the experience of aging out of care? And we ended that synthesis period that Emily was just describing with 3 answers and 3 big pillars that we believe that child welfare is missing when it comes to aging out, and that is now what Think of Us is focused on. So I'll kind of take them one at a time, if I can. Oops, one moment. There we go. The first one is around healing and dealing with trauma. And just to kind of ground us in some lived experiences, like you saw the artifacts, I'm just going to put up some quotes here that kind of relate to this. And I'll just pause talking for 1 minute and just give you an opportunity to get a flavor of some of what we heard by reading the screen. And basically what happened to us is that healing and dealing with trauma was really kind of the surprising one for us, even as an organization. And how it turns out and how we're thinking about it is that this is really kind of the elephant in the room with child welfare, and specifically with young people who age out, that basically everyone who gets to this point has experienced trauma. Normally, the reason why a young person gets into the system in the first place is because they've experienced some kind of trauma. Then the removal from the family is a trauma, which all foster youth experience by definition. And then the system often inflicts additional traumas on the young person, not always, but in many cases that happens. And so this kind of underlying trauma becomes kind of the elephant in the room that kind of everyone knows is there, but the system isn't really set up to meaningfully address. And this was clearly a lesson that we were supposed to learn, because when we arrived, first day on our first site, we walk in, and it was the beginning of November last year, and we walk into a site that was a resource center where lots of young people go. So youth hang out at this place. And right when we walk in, there was this big altar and kind of display in the lobby, and it was a Dia de los Muertos altar. It was just after October, and staff were in the process of taking it down, and we said, "Oh, tell us about that. What is that about?" And kind of true. Discovery sprint with kind of true discovery sprint inquiry. And basically what we had found out is that the staff a number of years ago had fallen into the pattern of doing a Dia de los Muertos celebration each year, because what had happened was a number of years ago, a former foster youth had passed away, and the staff were looking for a way to acknowledge the passing of this foster youth. And someone said, and in this particular county, 70% of foster youth are Hispanic. And someone said, oh, well, maybe we can lean on a cultural tradition to help us here. And someone said, okay, well, this is what, we could use a Dia de los Muertos kind of celebration for. And really interestingly, what happened is staff set that intention for that. But what happened is, very quickly, other foster youth began sort of co-opting that opportunity to address other traumas in their life. So like the intention of that particular moment was to honor this former foster youth had passed, but foster youth showed up with other traumas they were wanting to deal with, other people in their own lives that had passed, other traumatic things they had been through that they wanted to recognize. And very quickly, it became very evident to staff in this location that there was a whole lot of grief and sadness and trauma that foster youth were facing, that when given the opportunity to address it in some way, they kind of just ran with it. And now it has become a staple of what this one site does each November. Is they have an opening ceremony with a grief counselor, and youth are invited to say something and put something on the altar in commemoration. Also, throughout it'll stay up for 2 weeks, and throughout those 2 weeks, youth that didn't want to participate in that ceremony will kind of come and have a private moment and put something down. And then at the end of the several weeks, the grief counselor comes back and they have kind of a closing ceremony for it. And this was the very first thing we learned on the first day of the discovery sprint. And it was kind of right in our faces. And what we kind of saw again and again is that really the system lacks a shared vocabulary of how to even address the trauma of foster care. You know, unlike with someone passing, you know, someone said, you know, we have words to say when someone passes away. What do you say when someone gets removed from their family and we don't know when they're going back or if they'll ever get back? What do you say to them? So we really found this like missing shared vocabulary piece as one of the as something that's really missing. And then also the path to how to address it. And it's kind of, if we can't name it, we can't address it. And, you know, at best, you know, foster youth may be offered a path toward prescription medication or sometimes talk therapy. And that is pretty much it when it comes to the toolkit that youth are offered to address the trauma that they've been through. And it's not, you know, a holistic tool set. So this was something that was really top of mind for us. And then another kind of anecdote from this that really stands out is one youth workshop that we hosted. Young people started having this rich conversation around the sometimes very strong disciplinary actions that they are met with when they express sometimes just simple sadness. So one of the quotes here says, you know, I just want to be sad. And some foster youth in this discussion were really saying, like, even if I just show up and feel sad and express my sadness in any way, it's sometimes met with, you know, you should call the suicide hotline, or we need to have you to talk to somebody, or at worst, you know, feeling like you can't stay in your placement or going to be kicked out. And so really just realizing that there wasn't a lot of space in the system to allow youth to feel the very normal, obviously normal consequences of having lived through some of the life events that they have lived through. So this was very surprising for us. We didn't enter this sprint thinking that this one was going to be on the list, but it was kind of right in our faces, on that first day. Okay, I'll move to the second one, and this is about preparing youth for their aging out transition. And I will provide another moment for you to take a look at some of the quotations here. And I'll just reflect on this one, which is, so the system for young people who age out of care and they're not going back home, as Sixto said, they're not getting adopted, they're not finding another permanent family placement, they are just in foster care at the age that foster care ends and then they age out. For people who have this experience, the system is very focused on so-called preparedness, on having a place to live, on having a job, on having a path to education, having a path to money. The system and the staff are very focused on preparedness. So it would be kind of crazy on one level to say, well, how could you say the missing pillar is preparedness? Because the system is like radically focused on preparedness. What we found is that there is there's system-defined preparedness and there is youth-defined preparedness, and that sometimes there is a gap in those experiences. So I'll give you a very literal example, which is that we were talking to youth in one site, and in this state, there's extended foster care, which means you can stay in foster care through 21. And we would talk to staff as opposed to 18, which is it is in other states. And we would talk to staff, we would say, when does foster care end? And they would say 21. And we would talk to young people and would say, when does foster care end? And they would say 21. And then when we dug a little bit further, we found that when we asked foster youth to get a little more specific, they thought it meant through 21, which is to say until 22, as opposed to your 21st birthday, which is really through 20. So you have staff understanding that it's through 20 / your 21st birthday, and you have some young people thinking it's through 21, which is to say your 22nd birthday. And you have two people sitting across the table from each other saying the exact same words, and they're literally off by a year. And that's a very literal example of ways that things in the system can be lost in translation, but it is a real thing we found, and we kind of saw throughout that though the system is kind of beating its, doing the best job it can to really, do what it can on preparedness, that some of what it's doing can get literally lost in translation for young people. So that's a literal, kind of a literal example, but there's even more kinds of, take it one step back and like, it's the system that's defining what preparedness is, that it's a job, that it's employment, that it's education, it's housing, and it's the systems doing that. And we ask young people questions about those things. But this is kind of a good example of if you don't ask the right question, every answer feels wrong kind of thing. Because what we find is that if you actually ask youth about what's important to them, they will very often say different things than those things. Their answer may not be preparedness and housing. And I'll give you one really good example. In Hennepin County in Minneapolis does a really great program, which is called a Youth Transition Conference. And for young people who are aging out of care there, they have the option to participate in a voluntary conference. It's up to them. They get to decide if they want to do it or not do it. It's totally optional. And they get to design the meeting. They get to design who's going to be there, and they get to design what it's about. And it's the idea is that it's a transition meeting that helps you prepare for your transition out of care. And when what staff ask young people to do is to plan a meeting around, quote, the most important thing in your life. So young people will plan a meeting around the most important thing in their life. Interestingly, the topics that young people choose to make that meeting about are often very surprising to staff and also very different than what staff assume it will be. So staff report that they have had many, many youth transition conference meetings about foster youth who are transitioning genders. Now, if you were a young person transitioning genders, you can understand why that would be the most important thing in your life. But it's also not going to be on the templated form that staff have about preparedness. And so we really took away this idea that we have to be asking young people about what is most important to them, what elements of preparedness are most important to them, and how can we help achieve those preparedness goals before they exit care. And then the third one is around helping youth build a supportive network, of a network of supportive adults around them. So it's been the thesis of Think of Us and the interest and hypothesis of Think of Us for a long time that really the secret to what's kind of missing in child welfare, especially for older foster youth, is tapping into the network of supportive people around a foster youth, which is to say that if someone entered foster care because there was a breakdown in family relationships on some level, that the only true way to, address that problem is by helping to create or support other supportive relationships in the young person's life. So that said, there is a lot of misconceptions and beliefs around this concept in child welfare. For example, if you ask staff, staff have the belief that young people do not have supportive people in their life. As a stereotype, as a generalization, many staff have the idea that young people do not have supportive people in their life, that they're not there. So we wanted to do some myth busting and kind of figure that out. So what we did is we'd ask staff during our interview process, do young people have supportive people in their life? And very often they would say no. And then we'd go to young people and we would say, do you have supportive people in your life? And they would often say no. But we learned to ask the question differently. And thanks to Emily and Sarah for helping us think through this kind of on the fly, we started to say things like, okay, if you got sick at school one day, who would pick you up? And they would give a name and we'd say, okay, tell us about that person. Or if you had a job interview and you needed to ride to the job interview, who would drive you? And they would say someone, and we would ask about that person. Or as you saw in the youth artifacts, we looked at those network maps and we would see that almost no one, I think no youth had no one on their network map. Everyone had someone. So we feel like we really myth busted this idea that young people don't have anybody, that young people do have people. But what we were surprised by is that there's kind of a complex web of relationship dynamics going on within those relationships. For example, we uncovered that many young people, though they may have someone supportive in their life, like an aunt or a coach or a friend's mom, they have those people, but for a whole host of complicated reasons, they are shielding those relationships from child welfare. So they may not be literally telling their caseworker or social worker that this person exists. And there's all sorts of webs of relationship dynamics that explains that, including, you know, many young people don't trust the system, and every time they bring someone else, every time someone else engages the system, only bad things happen. So why would they introduce someone else to the system? So we feel like we really, in this work, validated something that we think we knew, which is that young people do have people. But what we uncovered in the process is that the way that young people manage these relationships, think about these relationships, protect and shield these relationships is really nuanced and complex. And if we're going to help young people and the system really maximize these relationships, we're going to have to understand those relationships dynamics to kind of a greater degree. I'll just give you a minute to see some of what we heard about this. So now that we've identified these, what we think are the three big opportunities and three missing pieces for youth who are aging out of care, we're really thinking about how can we design products and systems that target these three things and actually support these three pillars and actually improve these like core breakdowns in the system. I'm going to pass it to Sixto, who's going to just say a few words, and then I think we'll be moving into the discussion.
Thank you, Sarah, for that. One of the things I just want to highlight and point out is that we were able to get on a journey that really was able to empower young people to really say how they were feeling. And although these might seem like things that are kind of obvious, they weren't. And even when we were reporting back out to staff, there was these aha and these epiphany moments. And so the way, at first we had thought about doing this research and only focusing on how does this inform the kind of app that we're creating. But what we learned and what we realized as we were reporting back to our constituents was that this was so much more, this had a greater applicability, and that people who were just looking to improve their programs, people who were looking to improve the system, that all of them found a use to be able to have this. And really, what it boils down to is that this type of research that, we're grateful to our partners at Bloom for helping us execute here and designing, was that it really just put young people at the center. And it brought that proximity, not just to a product, but to how is it that my humanity exists within this bureaucratic web of decisions that are affecting my life. And so I'm just so honored to get into the panel now to talk with our colleagues about a little bit more about how that came to fruition and how it's playing out. So I think now we'll go ahead and move into the Q&A section. All right.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this. This is really, really incredible. I just love hearing about how the conversations lead to these sort of moments of sort of insight and illumination that drove you all to sort of shift your language, shift your approach sort of in flight. And it sounds like that was really, really critical to uncovering the things that really led you to these opportunities. Really unbelievable. I'd love to start on that note. It sounds like there were a couple sort of surprising moments at which your team pivoted while you were in the field. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about that. Was there Was there an especially surprising moment or insight that changed the way you thought about your research question? And not necessarily one, if there are more, feel free to dive into those as well.
I was about to say, like, where do we even start? Because this was like every night of every single discovery night that we were together, or, it's Slack messages back and forth. But I'll say this, I think that when we went into this, we thought about how the system can actually help and how the system can be the intervention. And I think the biggest epiphany and pivot was that understanding that no matter what, the intervention will never be a system, because, like our board member Megan would say, systems are cruel and people are kind. And that the real intervention is the human beings that are in the system, and that relationship that's needed to be there. And the system has a way of setting conditions that make it easier or very hard to be able to go ahead and engage in those relationships. And so to be able to decipher not just the bad things that were happening, not just the good things that were happening, but what were the conditions of the system that actually were inhibiting young people from feeling comfortable to say, hey, I'll go ahead and expose the adults that I really consider ride or die to you. Right? It was those nuggets that really blew my mind. And this is coming from someone who, I grew up in the system. The system is my parent. From 11 months years old, that baby boy, I went through the entire journey and aged out at 23. So as someone who really thought like I knew systems and I know the system back and forth, to be enlightened by this team that you see here was one mind-blowing experience.
Wow. Wow. Does anyone else want to jump in on that question? Wanted to look at the rest of the panel.
I just wanted to add one thing, I think, from a process perspective, and I think this is where, I don't know, I think as a researcher, when you do a lot of this work, you can like truly say that you've been transformed by the work, because you always like approach a project with like a perfectly designed like research plan. And this is, we're going to do these different methods, and we're going to this is how we're going to recruit all of our different groups of participants, et cetera, et cetera. And then you hit first contact with reality, and it kind of like unravels in a variety of ways. And one example of that actually was our approach to recruiting supportive people for youth, right? Like we had these partnerships with the different organizations in all different localities where the research took place. So we had access to paid staff, we had access to youth, and then we said, okay, well, our supportive people are going to be recruited through snowballing. We're going to first get introduced to the youth. We're going to get comfortable with them. We're going to maybe talk to them, and then we're going to ask them about people in their life that we can talk to. Turns out nobody wanted to introduce us to anybody. And that goes to show, actually, to reinforce the point that Sarah Sullivan talked about earlier, which is it ended up being a finding in itself, in that youth were so protective of the relationships that they had. And we were introduced by what are considered in their eyes agents of the child welfare. Like these are the social services agencies that are connected to the child welfare system. So by transitive properties, we were also connected to the child welfare system. So why would they expose these relationships that they would hold near and dear to their heart to us and risk that relationship? So it's always like in these moments where you're like, I had this perfect plan on paper, and then it just like not only unraveled, but also just like blew your mind in a completely different way.
Yeah, it sounds though that was the ability to do that kind of adjusting, and for you all to just roll with those changes as they were happening and sort of embrace the fact that your well-articulated plan had to just immediately change, was a huge part of what sounds like a really successful effort to dig into this question.
Well, Emily, let me just go ahead and put an asterisk there, that it requires those of us who haven't been part of this process before to actually trust the process and trust our colleagues. Because there were moments where I said, Lord Jesus, what is going on? And I really had to lean into trust. I remember vividly when we were synthesizing, me getting up and saying something just ain't right. I gotta go get some food. I gotta get something. But there are many moments in this sprint, and thank you to just everyone on the team, that they were just so in touch. We were doing a workshop and Sarah F comes by and she says, we're not getting what we're actually trying to learn. And it was such an epiphany, because sometimes we can get so excited about just hearing the stories that it's almost toxic in a way, where we're like, oh, we're hearing people's, suffering, and we're hearing their actual, pain points. But the reality is that if we're not actually trying to understand the specific learning agenda so that then we can do something about it, and we're just indulging in listening to the sad stories over and over and over again, right? There are moments where we were synthesizing and Emily and Sarah were like looking, and I was like, I have to take, the break because I don't know where this is going. And then being able to say, hey, trust the process, we're gonna get to that end outcome. And so I would just encourage folks, as you think about this work, it also requires a different, evolution of yourself, because you're going to have to question every single thing that you might think that you know about a problem.
It's incredible. That's really incredible. What an experience. On that, on a similar note, I'd love to talk a little bit more about the process itself, sort of on a more operational, on an operational front. I'm sure there were a lot of decisions being made and trade-offs between, where to go and who to talk to and what to focus on. Could you all talk a little bit about how you approached the planning? The planning, of course, as you mentioned, that ended up shifting down the road. But how did you approach planning and decisions on where to go and who to talk to, and how did that evolve?
I'll speak to one piece of it, and then Sixto probably can chime in on the location piece. But one thing that we didn't tease out, but is that we actually had intended to go to 3 sites. You'll remember that we ended up going to 5, but we originally had planned to go to 3, and we did those 3 last November. And then we met for that synthesis, which you saw the tiring video, amazingly, exhaustingly looking video from that. And basically, where we emerged from that moment was we were able to synthesize that down to what we identified as these 3 pillars and what we think are the 3 missing pieces or the 3 opportunities. But we hadn't had any time to really go deep into any of those 3 things. We were like, okay, great. We've just identified what we think the 3 missing pieces are. And now we're getting started. And so that's when we ended up going to 2 more sites this February, and then digging deep into those 3 things. And that's how we came to have some more clarity around those 3 things. And then our exploration obviously continues and is ongoing. But that was a pivot as well, which is that we thought, we were ambitious with what we could know at the end of 3 sites and the end of a couple months or whatever. But that's how we got from originally 3 to then saying, oh no, we got some more work to do, and went to 2 more in the spring. And Sixto, do you want to speak to maybe the locations? Or
Absolutely.
just how we think about that?
Absolutely. So some of the things that we thought about when we thought about locations were, what was the history of that jurisdiction being able to report out into the ecosystem? And so we knew Santa Clara County had not a unique, county-based system, but it also is known for all of its evidence-based programming that comes out. We looked for champions. Who was going to take the baton and run with it? Because this type of research requires deep trust with the community. And for us to come in and for us to ask questions, it's invasive, right? And so how might we partner with folks who have that true already relationship with young people to be able to do so? And the other couple of sites that we picked were really based on what did that site look like? Were you in a state system? Were you in a county-based system? Were you a private agency? So it gave us a different kind of flavor. All of them had a theme of being able to believe in young people and that young people should be at the center of it, as one of the gateways of actually accessing young people.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Sarah Fatala, I wanted to ask you about some of the adjustments that you all made. What are some of the ways that you have to adjust this type of research to work with more vulnerable communities like foster youth? I know you have experience in this sort of across the board, and would love to understand how you think about this.
Yeah, I think something that Emily touched upon earlier around like being aware of our positionality and being aware that we are strangers, that we hold more power, that we're coming in as attached to this whatever it is that the youth think of their agency, we were introduced by them. So whether that was positive or negative, we were ascribed those values immediately to the team. And I think one of the things that we went in being mindful of is how do we, one, gain trust, obviously, but also like how do we make this relationship a little bit less extractive than it would usually be, where we sort of sit people down and then we gather their wisdom and thoughts and then we leave. And I think part of that is understanding how trauma operates in sort of like the relational frame, where we as a research team and youth as participants, we try to make it more of a partnership rather than a sort of subject researcher relationship, where it's like understanding that they have control to opt out of different activities, that they have control to stop the interview at any time, that they have control to like skip questions. It's also, I think, a huge hat tip to think of us for being super on top of the idea of compensating youth fairly for their time and their wisdom. I think that's something that's often overlooked in the field, where we tend to not pay very well participants whom we engage. And it's also sharing meals or sharing food or sharing snacks as we're doing the activity, sort of like setting up an environment that doesn't feel super formal, that doesn't feel like there's space for failure if they don't answer the right way or if they don't say the right thing. It's just sort of, showing up in a way that feels like it's not the typical like paid staff showing up to, check a bunch of things off a list, get what they need, and then leave and never come back.
Yeah, sort of visually distinguish yourself from the people they associate with, what you're discussing. That's really interesting. So I know we have just a few minutes left, and I wanted to talk about the transition from, it's from insights to action, right? Like as someone who has gone through these types of research processes before, I know one of the hardest parts about it, in addition to synthesis, is taking what you've learned and doing something with it. So I wanted to get your thoughts, while we have you all on here, on how you think about taking this all and operationalizing it. What happens next, and what do you see as necessary for some of the changes and opportunities that you see to come to fruition?
Why don't I jump in with a few thoughts and then love to pass it to my colleagues. One, not to have the cop out, but one is literally just the process of doing this kind of work in child welfare is transformative. So like the fact that we are doing this work and then we're telling other people about this work, and then our colleagues are learning that they could themselves too talk to young people and might be able to incorporate what they think in the design and execution and reform of child welfare is itself transformational. So this has had ripple effects not only for our organization, but for other organizations that hear what we're up to and are like, child welfare behemoths that are like, oh, maybe I want some of that too. So that's one thing, and that's a ripple effect of this kind of work. But more specifically on these findings and what we found, I think, as Sixto mentioned, we were doing this work because we are building tech-enabled interventions to help improve the outcomes of young people aging out of care. And as folks know, technology is never the core problem of government services. So this was really an exploration to see, okay, what really are the core problems, and how, if we build technology, could we build technology that are building on and solving for the actual core problem. So like examples of the relationship piece. Like, Think of Us had been, prototyping and had, beta version of the Think of Us app, for a long time, and has done a great job. And until this sprint, had known that supportive people need to be a part of that technology. What we didn't know until we uncovered this is how that part was right. What we hadn't hit the nail on the head yet is how you construct and how you construct the interactions between the system, the supportive adults, and the young people. Because the mental models and the mental math that young people are going to when they decide which supportive person I'm looping in on which issue and what supportive person I'll allow to come in to which staff is all way more mental math going on than we realized. And so understanding that is critical to any technology that we build that ultimately puts these three groups of people in partnership with one another. So that's how it's, for example, impacting technology that we are pursuing. But then the other one, and that's kind of the expected outcome, like that's why we engaged in this research. But one of the other kind of unexpected outcomes is now we see how most systems have room to improve on these three opportunity areas. And so now what we're doing is also talking to systems about how they can improve on these three things. So we're in conversations with various agencies that really want to, we're in a moment where people are really ready to think outside the box and about institutions, and that's awesome. And so we're kind of capitalizing on that moment to say, great, while you're at it, look at these three things because you might have some room for improvement on them. So those are kind of three ways, both with the actual process of talking to young people, having ripple effects, the technology we're building, and then really thinking about how systems are designed, that this work kind of translates into real change.
Thank you all. So, it sounds like there's an enormous amount of potential and probably a number of different sort of ways this can all evolve. Emily Wright Moore, we have not heard from you on these questions yet. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to chime in on this, both on the opportunity side, or if we missed your voice on any of the previous questions about the research that led to these insights.
I've appreciated what everyone has said, so I haven't spoken because I've just been behind everybody. But I think moving forward, this is one of the hardest parts, right? Is like you have the research and you understand in some ways the vastness of the problems with more fidelity, right? Like, and I think you need the fidelity to know how to move forward, but it can be really hard to know where to start, because often the solutions start so small that they feel ridiculously tiny in the face of the thing that you're there to address, right? So I think that's one of the challenges for right now, is like where do you sort of decide to stake your tent or whatever you're doing to move forward and have a product or thing that will start to build towards a solution. So I think that's a big challenge. And I think Sarah Sullivan, you're totally right that like the act of distilling this information and reporting out on it is a huge step forward for all the different locations and sites, because they, I think, came to you thinking that you were going to solve for X, and you came back with you came back with Y, right? Like you came back with something else, and you're like, actually, like you're looking at the wrong thing. Why is mental health so low on your list of services for foster youth? So I think sometimes they need to travel that distance too before a solution is really going to be ready. So I'm excited to watch all the work that's been done since this discovery project, and I'm like, it's really an exciting industry right now. Like I think there's so much to do, and I'm really happy that Think of Us is making the time and space to actually understand how this might start to get better. So that's my.
I love that. And I think it ties very closely to something that Sixto said early on about the importance of the people and the organization that is sort of asking for a solution to X, right, to be open to and willing to evolve in that way, right? Not being so wedded to what X has been defined as initially, and having that ability to just go with it, and trust that process. Last call for any final thoughts before we close out and I hand it all back to Anna.
Well, I just want to close out by saying it has been truly an honor to be on this journey with my colleagues here. Whenever you can place yourself in the learning position from those who've experienced the problem directly, even when you have your own proximity to it, that's where the new insights come in. That's where you're able to use new insights to actually create a different world, right? And so for those who are considering this type of work, and I would totally encourage you to lean in, trust your partners, and collaborate differently. This is not a traditional consulting kind of gig. It is truly an integrated team of people, and how you build that trust and manage these situations is one that requires deep trust with your colleagues. And so that would be my parting words for you all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sixto. Sarah, go ahead.
Yes. Yeah, I just wanted to chime in and say, and just as one closeout, is that this truly is the first time we are sharing any of these lessons with anyone who wasn't directly a part of the research. So it's really exciting to do this, and thank you to Emily and the Beeck Center for providing the platform to do that. And we're in the final stages of finalizing what we are going to release publicly and share publicly about in the next month. So obviously our few minutes was just like a very, very small sample of like the massive amount of information that we learned as a part of this process. And so just wanted to say that if folks were interested in this and interested in learning more, that they can expect to see something about in the next month. And Emily, I'm sure we can work with you all to help get that out to folks who are interested in learning more.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you all again for your time, and for being so gracious with your insights and sharing your perspective with us.